There's a moment, isn't there? A moment that happens quietly, without an audience. It's usually in the morning when the light is unforgivingly honest, or perhaps late at night when you're brushing your teeth, your mind finally quiet enough to notice the small things. You lean into the mirror, maybe to get a stray eyelash, and you see her. The woman is looking back at you. She's familiar, of course. Those are your eyes, the ones that have cried at weddings and graduations, the ones that have crinkled in laughter over 1,000 shared jokes. That's your mouth. That has whispered secrets and sung lullabies. But something is different. You see the light differently. It seems to pass right through the hair at your crown, illuminating your scalp in a way it never used to. The part in your hair seems wider, a little more generous than it used to be. And in that quiet, solitary moment, a stranger looks back at you, a stranger you are only just beginning to know. This isn't a story about panic. It's not about rushing to the store for some miracle cure or frantically searching for ways to turn back the clock. We've lived long enough to know that the clock only moves in one direction. And fighting it is a fool's errand, a waste of the precious energy we've worked so hard to cultivate. No, this is a story about a conversation. A conversation with that woman in the mirror. It's about learning to see her not as a collection of losses, the loss of collagen, the loss of pigment, the loss of density in your hair, but as a testament to a life fully lived. I remember a dear friend of mine, a woman who had the most glorious, thick auburn hair in her youth. It was her signature. People would stop her on the street. When it began to thin in her late 50s, it felt like a betrayal. She told me it was as if her own body was slowly erasing the person she had always been. She'd spend hours trying to arrange it, teasing it, spraying it into submission, only to feel a sense of dread every time the wind blew. One day, she was looking at an old photograph of herself, her magnificent hair caught in the sunlight. She felt the familiar pang of grief, but then something shifted. She looked from the photograph to her reflection, and for the first time, she didn't see what was missing. She saw the silver strands that had appeared after she nursed her husband through a long illness. She saw the finer texture that came after her children had grown and flown, when she finally had time to travel and swim in salty seas. Her hair wasn't gone. It had simply recorded her history. It was the archivist of her heart. This is the first and most crucial step in finding a haircut that suits you. It's not about finding a style that hides or distracts. It's about letting go of the ghost of the hair you once had. We spend so much time mourning that ghost, don't we? We see the ponytail that is now half its former size, or we find the little collection of strands on the pillow and think, with a touch of gallows humor, that we're shedding enough to knit a small furry pet. But what if we stopped mourning and started listening? What if we treated our hair not as a wilting plant we're desperately trying to revive, but as a wise old friend who is telling us something new? The truth of life is that we are not meant to be static creatures, preserved in amber. We are rivers, constantly flowing, changing course, deepening in some places, and becoming softer in others. Your hair is part of that river. To fight its current is to exhaust yourself. To learn to flow with it is to find a new kind of power, a new kind of grace. This is your crown. It was never about the thickness or the color. A woman's crown isn't the hair on her head, but the wisdom in her eyes. The hair is just a beautiful, evolving frame. So, before we even think about scissors or styles, let's stand in front of that mirror again. Let's find a moment of peace. Take a breath. Look at the woman staring back. See the journey in her face. See the strength in her gaze. And then look at her hair. See it not as thinning, but as softening. See it not as fading, but as lightening. It is preparing for a new chapter, one that requires less weight, less maintenance, and more freedom. It's asking you to let go of the old battles so you can embrace a new kind of beauty. A beauty that doesn't shout, but whispers. A beauty that is rooted not in perfection, but in acceptance. This is where the real transformation begins. Not in the salon chair, but right here, in the quiet, honest space between you and your reflection. Now that you've had that quiet conversation with the woman in the mirror, now that you've decided to be her friend instead of her critic, we can begin the gentle, joyful work of discovering what comes next. The journey to a haircut that feels like a homecoming is not about scouring magazines for the latest trends or trying to replicate the hairstyle of a 25-year-old actress. It's about understanding a fundamental principle of art, of nature, and now of your beauty, the principle of softness and light. Think about how light works in a home. A single harsh overhead bulb can make a room feel sterile and stark, highlighting every speck of dust and every imperfection. But when you add softer, gentler sources of light, a lamp in the corner, the warm glow from a fireplace, the morning sun filtering through a sheer curtain, the room becomes inviting. It breathes. It has depth and warmth. The same is true for your hair. For years, we were taught that to deal with thinning hair, we needed to force it into submission. We'd get blunt, severe cuts, thinking a solid line would create the illusion of thickness. We'd plaster it with sprays and mousses, creating a stiff, immovable helmet that we hoped would hide the scalp beneath. But all this does is create that single, harsh overhead light. It creates a solid block of color and shape that paradoxically makes the lack of density even more apparent. The secret is to invite the light in. A soft haircut with subtle blended layers and feathered ends does exactly that. It breaks up the solidness. It creates movement and texture, allowing light to play through your hair, dancing between the strands. This play of light and shadow is what creates the illusion of fullness and dimension. It's not about hiding anything. It's about creating such a beautiful, dynamic landscape that no one is looking for what's missing. They're simply captivated by the gentle energy you exude. I remember a woman I met at a pottery class. She was a retired history professor, sharp and witty, with a twinkle in her eye, but her hair always seemed to be at odds with her spirit. She wore it in a perfectly coiffed, sprayed-in-place bouffant that looked like it hadn't changed since 1985. It was her armor. She later told me she spent a fortune on volumizing products and countless anxious minutes each morning constructing it, terrified a breeze might reveal her thinning crown. One day, she came into class and I almost didn't recognize her. She had cut her hair. It was a short, soft, layered pixie, brushed forward with a bit of playful texture. The light caught the silver and blonde strands. Her scalp was no longer the focal point, and for the first time, I felt like I was seeing her. The armor was gone. She looked radiant, free, and 10 years younger, not because the haircut was a young style, but because it was a happy style. It matched the twinkle in her eye. She laughed and said, "I finally got tired of wearing a hat indoors." That's the kind of self-aware humor that only comes when you finally let go of a battle you were never meant to win. Here is a piece of advice that I believe is one of the most valuable truths in this journey. When you go to your stylist, don't say, "I want a haircut that makes me look younger." Instead, try saying, "I want a haircut that makes me feel joyful." Or, "I want a style that feels light and easy." Or even, "I want a haircut that looks good even when it's messy." This changes the entire conversation. It shifts the goal from chasing an impossible past to embracing a beautiful present. A good stylist will understand this language. They will understand that you're not asking for a miracle. You're asking for a collaboration. You're asking to be seen. This is the art of softness. It can be a classic bob, but one with shattered, textured ends instead of a blunt, severe line. It can be a shoulder-length cut, but with long seamless layers that encourage a bit of a wave and movement. It can be a pixie cut that's soft and feathery, not severe and geometric. The goal is to create shapes that are forgiving, that don't require perfection. The truth of life is that perfection is brittle. It's the things with a little bit of give, a little bit of softness, that have the most resilience and enduring beauty. Think of a mighty oak in a storm versus a flexible willow. The willow survives because it knows how to bend. Your hair is asking for that same wisdom. It's asking to be a willow, not an oak. It's asking for a style that can be tousled by the wind, that you can run your hands through, that looks just as lovely air-dried on a Sunday morning as it does styled for a Saturday night. It's a haircut that gives you back time, energy, and peace of mind. And what, my dear friend, is more beautiful than that? We've talked about meeting the woman in the mirror with kindness, and we've explored the beautiful, transformative power of softness and light. Now we arrive at the most exhilarating part of this journey. This is where we take all that acceptance and all that gentle artistry, and we turn it into a declaration. This is where your haircut becomes your own quiet, powerful anthem of freedom. For decades, you've likely had hair that had a job to do. It had to be professional for the office. It had to be practical for raising children. It had to be acceptable to a partner, to your mother, to the world. It had to be anything and everything, but perhaps purely and unapologetically yours. The freedom you have earned after 50 years on this earth is not just financial or familial. It is a spiritual and aesthetic freedom. It is the freedom to finally stop performing. Imagine for a moment all the invisible rules you've followed about how a woman of a certain age should look. She should be sensible, quiet, and understated. She should gently fade into the background. Now imagine taking those rules, writing them down on a piece of paper, and setting them gently alight. That is the spirit we are bringing to this final step. Your haircut is no longer a concession to age or a solution to the problem of thinning hair. It is a celebration of your liberation from all of that noise. I am reminded of my mother. For 40 years, she was a high school principal. Her hair was a non-negotiable part of her uniform, a helmet of perfectly sprayed, dark brown hair that could withstand a fire drill in a hurricane. It was her armor of authority. When she retired, she seemed a little lost, as if she had forgotten who she was without the title on her office door. Her hair, which was now thinning considerably, remained her biggest source of anxiety. She kept trying to replicate the old style, but it was like trying to build a fortress with half the bricks. One afternoon, I took her to my stylist, a young woman with kind eyes and purple hair. My mother sat stiffly in the chair, clutching her purse, and explained her problem. The stylist listened patiently, then looked at her in the mirror and asked a question my mother had never considered. "But what have you always wanted to do?" My mother was silent for a long time. Then in a small voice, she said, "I always wanted to be a redhead. And I've always wondered what I'd look like with short curly hair." An hour later, she walked out of that salon a completely different woman. She had a soft, short, layered cut that released the natural wave she'd been suppressing for decades, and it was dyed a beautiful, shimmering shade of copper gold. It was bold and soft all at once. The first time she went to her old grocery store, the checkout girl, who had seen her every week for 20 years, said, "I love your hair. You look like you're about to go on a wonderful adventure, bitch." My mother's self-aware humor kicked in, and she winked, saying, "Who says I'm not?" She didn't look 20 years younger. She looked timeless. She looked like herself, finally. Here is a piece of advice that I hold dear. Treat your hair now as your greatest accessory, not your greatest vulnerability. You've spent a lifetime cultivating your inner landscape, your intelligence, your compassion, your resilience. That is the substance of who you are. Your hair, it's the beautiful silk scarf you chose to wear today. It can be playful, it can be elegant, it can be minimalist. You can change it next month if you want. It is no longer tied to your identity or your worth. When you detach from it in this way, you are free to simply have fun, to play. When was the last time you truly played with your look without worrying about the consequences? The profound truth of life is that we spend the first half of our lives accumulating duties, expectations, possessions, and the opinions of others. The second half of our lives, the richer half, is about the art of letting go. We let go of who we thought we were supposed to be to finally embrace who we are. Your new haircut is a physical manifestation of this beautiful, sacred act of release. It's an anthem that says, "I am done with the cage. I was never locked in. I just thought I was." It's a style that doesn't require you to look in the mirror every hour to check on it. It's a style that allows you to forget about your hair entirely so you can get on with the far more interesting business of living your life. It is the quiet, confident punctuation mark on the long, incredible sentence of your story so far. And it whispers with every soft movement that the best is yet to come. And so we come to the end of our time together, but to the beginning of a new way of seeing. This journey, from the quiet conversation with the mirror to the joyful anthem of a new haircut, was never really about hair at all, was it? It was about kindness. It was about granting yourself the same grace and gentleness you have so freely given to others throughout your life. It was about permission, the permission to be soft, to be comfortable, to be free, to let go of the battles that no longer serve you, and to walk forward with a lighter heart and a lighter spirit. There is no pressure here. No call to action requires you to rush out and change. The only invitation is an internal one, to look at the woman you are today, with all of her history etched in the silver of her hair and the wisdom in her eyes, and to love her wholly, unconditionally. Let this be a moment of peace, a quiet breath in your day. You have been on a meaningful journey for more than 50 years. Move forward from this moment with the calm, grounded inspiration that comes from knowing you are, and have always been, enough.